This is the God, Man and Markets podcast, conversations on faith, culture and the economy.
So I think Illich continues on his journey here in this book to promote his view of what he calls the vernacular culture and his demolition of modernity's institutionalization of life and virtues. So in the first chapter that we talked about, it was about language and how taught language came to take over the world. In the second chapter, the last one, entitled "The War on Subsistence," we talked about, expanded on that theme, and it was an apology of a life of subsistence as opposed to a life of mass production. So here in this chapter, research by people, he seems to be attacking modernity's ostensibly most prized benefit or most cherished benefit, which is scientific progress. And he does this by way of talking about what seemed to be a nascent movement at the time that he wrote the book in the 1980s, a movement of science by people as opposed to science for people, meaning a movement of people doing some research on a lower scale basis, not with the intention of mass producing technology and goodies for the rest of the world, but primarily to help themselves or to try to live better lives. So that's his introduction at the beginning of the chapter. And then he goes back in history, as he typically does, and introduces Hugh of St. Victor, a 12th century scholastic or theologian who wrote about the medical arts, and Illich is very happy with the angle or the approach that Hugh of St. Victor takes on his discussion of the medical arts, as opposed to the way it would be corrupted later. Maybe in later scholasticism, and then particularly with Bacon and the modern sciences attempt to overcome nature and as opposed to what Hugh of St. Victor tries to introduce, which is a way of developing mechanical arts and science, if you will, in that sense, to improve, for the development of human virtue, as a self-help endeavor. Not so much as a mass-produced technological achievement for the betterment of mankind in an impersonal way. That's what I got out of the chapter, at least in brief. Any thoughts on that, or did anybody read it differently?
Father, why don't you come in, because you told us before you some familiarity with Hugh of St. Victor.
Yeah. No, I got a lot. Absolutely. Yeah, I got a lot out of this chapter, and basically, I got the same thing, Dr. Laccade, the same kind of things out of it. Hugh of St. Victor wrote a very classic work, his Didascalicon, in the 12th century, which became a standard text for philosophy throughout the High and late Middle Ages, even into the Renaissance. And in this text, he lays out his vision, his kind of the whole scholastic, very symphonic, holistic vision of how sciences play into life as a whole. And he saw science and the technical arts, particularly what we now call the mechanical arts, as all following a similar ratio of taking their cue from nature, as being consistent with nature, and particularly technology, or what he would call techne, craft, as an imitation of the ratio or the reason that the human person is able to see in nature. So nature, for Hugh of St. Victor and for all the scholastics, was a medium that was saturated with reason. It was saturated through with a type of ratio that became a pattern for human life. And the arts and sciences, and the mechanical arts, techne in particular, was a means by which the human reason could imitate nature and indeed augment nature's own inner ratio in order to truly better human life, and in a sense make up for the primordial fall of man and the disharmony that has accrued between the human person and nature. And I think Ivan Illich draws a sharp contrast between that understanding of science and techne and what we now have in the modern world, starting with Francis Bacon, starting with the nominalists, where nature itself, and I would say it's not so much a different understanding of science or techne as much as it is an understanding of man's relationship to nature. And what is nature for man? What is nature going to be for man? So for the classical worldview, nature was almost like nature was in a sense a teacher, because there was embedded in nature, there were certain teleologies that actually invested human action with a type of meaning. And then ultimately it gave a model and a direction to human science. But starting with Bacon, starting in the Renaissance, you have something different. You have a notion of nature which is sapped of that innate natural reason that the scholastics saw. And so now nature becomes almost like a blank slate, a template. It is just a blank canvas on which the human will can paint whatever it wants. And the purpose of the sciences is to, quote, unlock nature's secrets, not so that we can read the ratio in nature and follow nature's principles and reason, but rather so that we can control nature and render nature subservient to our own will. It's a very different notion of man's relationship to nature, and it's ultimately a very different notion of the technical arts, whether that be science or medicine or mechanics or anything like that, that the relationship between man and nature is one where man controls nature for his own ends, rather than one where man is able to read in nature the end-directed and goal-directedness that's already embedded in the universe. And that's a huge topic. And I think Ivan Illich he has some profound insights as to the juxtaposition between those two worldviews and what it actually does to science. And it changes the nature of science precisely because it changes the nature of man's relationship to the world around him. Science no longer becomes what it traditionally was, which was scientia, knowledge. It's no longer scientia, but it's reduced to techne. It's reduced to mere technology. Whereas scientia was a type of speculative, contemplative act, rather than techne, which is a practical act of art, of craft, of kind of tinkering with nature to basically force nature to be subservient to the human will, rather than a speculative understanding of the sciences as gazing upon the reason and the wisdom built into nature. And so that's what I took. I think Ivan Illich's his reflections are very powerful. He didn't go with it towards the end of the chapter. He didn't go with it as far as I expected him to go with it. He mentions this distinction, but he doesn't really come to a lot of his own conclusions.
Whenever I see these criticisms of modern science, the question I always want to put to them is, well, okay, it's not perfect, and there are these difficulties, and there's a lot of pollution, and so our interaction with the environment is not perfect. But what about all the benefits and the advantages? Would this have come with the Hugh of St Victor method? Or would we still be in a sort of subsistence model where everybody's trying to work out their own little vernacular science, and the rate of progress is much slower? Is that what he's thinking of? And we'd be happy as a result? Any thoughts on that? Or
Well, Yeah, I have some thoughts on that, David. My answer to that question would be, well, first of all, to the question, like, what about the benefits of modern science? Would we have been able to enjoy all the benefits of modern science and technology even without the Renaissance turn? I believe the answer, first of all, the answer is we'll never know. We'll never know completely. I think the answer is it's highly probable that yes, we would still have many of the benefits of the modern science and modern technology, because many of the benefits of modern technology and modern science, which nobody wants to doubt, have certainly blessed the world. I think none of the blessings of modern science would necessarily be disqualified or rendered inaccessible to a view of science that predominated in the Scholastic and High Middle Ages.
So it's not so much then a negation of the scientific method. I mean, there's another, as you say, we never know what would have happened, that we can't predict it. But in principle, we can imagine a situation where the scientific method, which seems to be disintegrating in the modern age, incidentally, but nevertheless, could have been the same, but the ends to which it's directed would be different. So, and so potentially then the benefits to man would be greater, not less, than what we have now.
I think it's highly probable that would have been the case. I don't think that the scientific method per se is fundamentally bound to a philosophical view of nature, which is nominalistic. I believe I believe the scientific method, which is one of observation, testing, repeatable results, constantly checking theory with observation. This actually has its proper habitat within a scholastic understanding of natures, actually, rather than a fully nominalistic understanding of the world as a mere mechanical backdrop of man. And I actually
can you dig in a little more and just define nominalism? I think that you probably did it somewhere in there, but I still kind of missed it because that's a new term for me.
Nominalism would just be a movement in philosophy of the high and late Middle Ages, which basically denied the reality of essences and things, denies the reality of substances and essences, and reduces all nature to particulars rather than universals. Basically, it's a denial of universal natures subsisting in things, and a reduction to everything as individuals, particulars. Simply put. Okay. All right.
Connection between the four of us as men is actually just something that we imagine that isn't actually real.
Yeah, there's no real essence of man. That's simply a name. Where do you get the term nominalism? Yeah, that's where we get the term nominalism. That's a mere name for human language and human convention. But there is no reality of man, and ultimately then no human nature per se that we all share in common.
It's interesting to me that you use the term read into nature. I think when you were describing the older view of science, because in another a book written about Ivan Illich, one that Michelle and I spent some time with by David Cayley, called Ivan Illich, An Intellectual Journey, he probes into Hugh of St. Victor a little bit and his influence on Ivan Illich, and notes that there's this kind of metaphor of that nature is a kind of book in a way, or that it's composed of a certain language. And I think that we could look at science on the one hand as the endeavor to understand the patterns and algorithms and rules governing this language, as opposed to the Baconian notion of dominating nature, I guess. And both of them seem like they can lead to technological progress, as David is hoping for. The question is whether we're really considering the philosophy of technology, the technology as the actual study of techne, not as the techne itself, not as the techniques. Technology as the original meaning of the word, which would be sort of the study of technology. So I read in this chapter that Illich is hoping to revive a sense of curiosity and curiosity, I guess, as the foundation of our inquiry, rather than the sort of means ends framework of just getting what we want, or sort of the self-help framework, if you will. What do you guys think?
I agree with you. I'm going to put it in a different way and just give you my reaction to the chapter. And I don't know if this was Illich's point, actually, because a bit like you, Father, I couldn't quite work out what he was actually proposing. I found the information about Hugh of St. Victor absolutely fascinating. Again, with all his writing, there are these historical details of things that I'd never known about before. He sort of homes in on some little corner of history, if you like, that I was previously unaware of, and makes it relevant to a sort of greater whole, a greater story in a fascinating way. But what I was thinking about as I was reading I was thinking of we have the science, which I would say is not exclusively Baconian. I think to characterize it all as a sort of cynical domination of nature is not quite right. It's certainly there. It's problematic, but a lot of the benefits, I think, are good and harmonious in many ways, I think. But nevertheless, I would accept the general criticism. And then we have the situation today in which a lot of modern people feel that as well. They feel that man is in conflict with the natural world. And their response, therefore, is to say man is intrinsically bad and to want us to withdraw. And this is the modern sort of radical ecological movement, which wants to leave nature alone. Just let it get on with it. We're the problem. And the only way to save the world is to reduce the number of people. And this leads to the drop in the birth rate, promotion of contraception, abortion, because we need to reduce human activity, which is intrinsically against nature. So it has this view of man as unnatural, if I can use that phrase, not in harmony with nature. Whereas actually, Hugh of St. Victor is offering something else. He's offering a positive view of man who can work with the cosmos in order to raise it up through God's grace, just as Adam the gardener would have done in Eden. Just to raise it to what it ought to be. And so it's, as you say, it's not so much the scientific method would be different. Maybe some new alternative approach would have come out of this, I don't know. But it's more the ends to which it's directed, and which potentially would be for the greater benefit of man and of the world as well. There wouldn't be these ecological problems. In fact, it would be perfecting nature as well. Now, what occurred to me, I'm just going to finish this one point to make before you say that, is that there is a traditional study of the cosmos that would direct the scientist, and that is that looking at it for the patterns of beauty. So the mathematics of beauty, for example, would work alongside the mathematics of physics, if you like, and would actually direct the choices. So beauty is a principle of choice. And once you understand the basis of the beauty of the cosmos, you can say, okay, how do we direct our activity for the good, for the common good in the greatest sense, the good of the whole universe in a sense, and beauty becomes the principle by which we work in harmony with nature and in harmony with the rest of mankind as a scientist. And that could be introduced and added to what scientists know from here, I think. And it's a third way.
I think it's I completely agree with you. And I think what changed is kind of like what I said before, what changed in the Renaissance was not so much method. So with the dawn of what we might call modern science was not so much the advent of a method, but the advent of a new way in which men started to see their relationship to nature. They related to nature almost like domineering masters, not as those who were part of nature itself, part of that nature that God created. And then, as you said, Charlie, kind of reading into nature, reading into the book of nature, a kind of wisdom of God. And so this is why you have sort of the incoherence of today, a lot of the incoherencies where at one and the same time we want to care for nature, but then we see ourselves as human beings as somehow being a part of nature, being separate from nature. So we as human beings are like above nature, controlling nature, either destroying nature or saving nature, rather than being an integral part of nature. That's what I say.
And just to support your, having said I was a little bit suspicious of it, to support your sort of local vernacular point, Michel, I always think of farming. And if you look at traditionally farmed lands in Europe, or even those that are being preserved, such as in Vermont or something like that, there is a beauty to them, which is glorious. Modern farming methods, on the whole, just flatten the landscape and just obliterate it. They don't work with it at all. And so there is a way in which man can work productively and harmoniously, and when he does so, it is beautiful. And I think that what this offers actually is greater productivity, greater utility in that sense for man.
That's interesting. But do you think, to go back to the point you were making earlier, do you think in those farms, that this more traditional way of living with nature, do you think that beauty was actually a guiding principle for the people, or did it just emerge naturally out of this more natural relationship between man?
I think it emerged naturally,
and nature.
I think it emerged naturally, but I think it was, in a sense, I think that it was part of what they did. They wouldn't have articulated in that way. Okay, what is the most beautiful choice? But I think they did have a sense in the past of working with nature. I mean, for them, it was much more powerful. They didn't really have the option of just sort of shutting out the forces of nature and making it do what they wanted in quite the same way. So they had to work with it. But I think if we're going from where we are now, we probably would need to take that route where we do it more consciously than they did in the past.
Right. That sounds great. I'm going to quibble maybe a little bit on one point. I think the scientific method, if you understand it in its, the textbook definition of it, of experimentation, observation, experimentation, validation, whatnot, that's pretty much nominalist. I mean, it's baked into nominalism. And it assumes this process of trying to get nature to reveal its secrets and it assumes, this position of man being outside, an observer, and whatnot. And the experimentation itself is sort of a manipulation of nature, as opposed to, I think, what the scholastics and people before would have. You would reason about nature, but it was always, you would never experiment on nature in order to understand it better, because the process of experimentation itself introduces, it's an artifact, right? And then you have to understand, well, how does the artifact relate to true nature? And this is a problem that we're dealing with constantly right now. This, you've heard about the reproducibility crisis in science right now. So you run an experiment. It's dominant in psychology, for example. You run an experiment, you get some results, and then what does that mean? You run it again, and you get different results. And what does that mean? And how do you decide what's the generality out of the experimentation that you've, So I think that part of modern science would probably not have been. On the other hand, technological development could have continued, because technological development does not really depend on the strict scientific method.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Because it's people trying things out and seeing if they work, basically. And
correct. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot more that is known from just experimentation and trying things out, and random chance events and decision, than there is about a formal scientific method.
But that's very helpful. That's a distinction that actually helps me a lot, because I was always, and I still am, of the belief that we would have still been able to enjoy many of the benefits of modern science even without the nominalistic term. And still, I'm not entirely convinced, Michel, that the method itself would not have in some way, and the benefits of the method would not have in some way evolved even outside of nominalism. I don't know.
I don't know either. But I mean, I think my impression is that it is precisely, it comes out of the imagination of Bacon, and with a certain presupposition about how nature operates. But as I said, so another point that I wanted to also make. Are you familiar with the historian Peter Harrison? He's a contemporary historian who writes and lectures a lot about this alleged conflict between religion and science, and he traces its history, and he says that it's a flawed conflict. But even, I mean, the notion of science, what we use, the terms that we use to refer to science and religion today are very different from how the terms were used back in the Middle Ages or in antiquity and so forth. And one point he makes is that up until the adoption of Aristotelian thought in the Middle Ages, the view of nature, at least in the West, was primarily symbolic, right? So Aristotle brings in the causal understanding of nature, whereas before then, and I think Hugh of St. Victor would probably fall in the pre-Aristotelian scholasticism, where the understanding of nature is primarily in terms of symbols. What does this mean symbolically, as opposed to trying to understand what its real causes are, not the nominalist causality, but the real causality, which I think there's nothing. I'm a born again Aristotelian myself, so I'm okay with understanding the world in terms of its causality. But I thought it was very intriguing to think about how nature was viewed before the High Middle Ages, when Aristotelian thought was introduced, and I think Hugh of St. Victor probably viewed it with this sort of symbolic analogy lens, as opposed to a strictly philosophical, deductive lens of cause and effect, which, in a way, this cause and effect view ends up being distorted by nominalism and used in a mechanical way later on. So it's kind of an interesting evolution in the thinking. And then one other point that I wanted to make here is, when you read Illich, sometimes So of course he wants to go back to, he wants to recapture, again, we talked about it on the previous episodes, whether it ever existed or not, this vernacular way of being, or whether it's imaginative or not. But at the same time, he makes arguments that oftentimes in these momentous changes in the way we think about, he says that it's as a result of technological development. So, for example, Hugh of St. Victor talks about the mechanical arts, but then within a few decades, there's the introduction of the mill and the plow. And Illich, I think in passing, seems to say that once that was introduced, then there was no going back to the way Hugh of St. Victor would have wanted it. And then it makes you think, well, if that's the case, I mean, is that deterministic? I mean, are we sort of enslaved by these technological developments that carry us forward because we become corrupted by whatever benefit they bring? I don't know. Did you get that impression that from time to time he will say, he will have this view of historical development that is brought about not so much by people's ideas, but by certain technologies. We saw it in a way with the introduction of, when he talked about language, right? The introduction of.
I definitely saw that in the chapter regarding language. I didn't see this particular chapter as having those kind of deterministic tones as much, but I think it's there a little bit.
What I did see in common with that is that the sense I get, and I always feel uneasy about it, is this sort of romantic view of the past, which I think is exaggerated. I think your description of the symbolic view, I don't think that and the shall we say the Aristotelian are mutually exclusive. I think they can both be there, which means that I do think that you can add to what we have now. You can inform it with a symbolic view. That the mathematics of beauty is derived from even looking at the symbolism of the numerical patterns that describe the cosmos. That is how it's approached. And I don't think it excludes the modern conception of mathematics at all. I think one can work in harmony with the other. And I'd love to see that happening. That was one of the things that's driven me to write The Way of Beauty, for example, is in the hope that might happen.
Right. No, I think you're right. And then one final thought, I want to bring it back to Charlie, because when I read this chapter, it made me think of you and the kind of work that you're doing. This sort of research, that when he talks about this movement of science by people instead of science for people, and I thought about the book that you wrote, Charlie, and you trying to understand how we're supposed to eat better, and how our ways of living can be improved through reflection, and this seems to be research by people, not research for people. What are your thoughts?
I had some of the same thoughts just about, I think it's interesting that he defines science, first of all, as a kind of holistic healing paradigm in a way, healing this rift that's caused by, human disruption of the environment, which he equates with the fall. And I do think that, in my research into health, I always start with the ancestral perspective. Some people call it evolutionary fitness. I prefer ancestral health because we're kind of, just going back as far as we can into our human origins to say, what conditions might have been around in the kind of critical period for human beings. And then what might have happened to us that lowered us to our present stature, because we know from archaeological records, for example, that people 100,000, 200,000 years ago living around the Fertile Crescent, that they had their bone structure was different. They were taller on average. The women had wider hips. And so we can speculate that something probably related to agriculture came about that led to in grain production, that this led to a shrinking of human stature. And it's recorded as this very poetic historical memory in Genesis of the pains becoming greater in childbirth, and by the sweat of your face you shall work in the fields all the days of your life. So I do think that the kind of the paleo people or the evolutionary fitness people are onto something with that, and they have more in common with the believers or the people that are using religious texts as their guide than they might realize. And there's another parable that I touch on in my book, Hormetics, which I think perfectly illustrates the distinction between research by people and research for people. And it's the story of Syngenta, which is an agrochemical company that produces a fertilizer called atrazine, which is used widely in sort of industrial farming around the country. And it's found its way into waterways. And there was a UC Berkeley scientist who was studying the effects of this atrazine fertilizer on the reproductive systems of frogs. He was a biologist, and he noticed that these frogs were exhibiting signs of hermaphrodism. They had ambiguous genitalia, and the male frogs were humping one another. And this is not sort of like evolutionarily adaptive behavior. So in looking at what might be causing it, he found that this chemical atrazine may have been responsible. And then there's a whole story of kind of the intimidation campaign waged by Syngenta against this researcher. And I think that I don't really know the motives of the scientists at UC Berkeley, but I think that he was primarily motivated by a kind of curiosity. And his discovery was that these endocrine disruptors, which also have effects potentially on human beings, is a source for potential concern. And I think that's where Illich is really looking at how we need to be more critical of technology. And Illich proposes this term, critical technology, for this new study of this sort of philosophy of technology. And I think that we need more of that as well, just thinking about how our, science for people and the promise of, agrochemical innovation can end up turning on us if we have the wrong outlook at the outset.
No, that's interesting. And on the question of ecological movement and development, again, interestingly, maybe presciently, in 1980 or whenever he wrote this book, Illich, jabs the green movement of his day for being primarily, again, a research for people as opposed to research by people, because it uses the same sort of tools of mass production and to try to correct the ecological problems by using similar methods. I'm trying to find the passage here where he says, Bacon has been made into a whipping boy, and although his style has gone out of fashion, his general optimism remains intact. This can be well documented from contemporary ecology-oriented R&D, research and development. Such an endeavor seeks to replace the domination of nature through torture by an alternative approach, the seduction of nature through blandishment. And So I thought that was funny and quite right. I mean, he's very consistent and very precise in his thoughts. So he's not. I get it that there is maybe a romanticism to David, as you mentioned, to the past and whatnot, but he's not a sort of a pie in the sky, Green New Deal guy. He's right.
No, and I think that the Green New Deal, in a way, is a better archetype for the R&D type of mindset that he's really harshly criticizing, really trying to reshape the world in this image. But to be an equal opportunity critic of both the sort of left-wing economics and more libertarian or right-wing economics, he uses the term human action at one place in the chapter, and it's to refer to the human action of Eve, or Adam and Eve, basically eating the fruit from the tree, and so human action in the Austrian school is equated with purposeful action and sort of being a good thing, this instrumental capacity that we have to try to meet our needs more efficiently. But the way that Illich is using the term human action, he's associating it with something that turned out to be pretty counterproductive, to say the least. And so this idea of human action, even when it's individual human action being, guided toward satisfaction of one's own needs, can still kind of lead us astray. I thought that was gave me pause and makes me think about just all the ways that sometimes in trying to further myself, I end up further behind than when I started.
Very good. Any thoughts on how can that what does that mean 40 years later, right? Illich wrote this in 1980. Do we see his thoughts having any influence or bearing, or can his reflections guide us in any way? Do you see any hope in taking whatever good is in his writings and applying it to our lives?
Well, I would say that the theme that comes through, as I do like, is his mistrust of solutions imposed from above, and so that, as you mentioned, he's critical of what happened. The introduction of these sort of institutions beginning around the time of the Renaissance and moving forward, and the Enlightenment, but also the fact that the modern solutions to this are just alternative, centrally imposed answers that come out of the same paradigm. And it's like two different firms of management consultants vying for control of something, but they're not they don't really have anything different to offer. I think in regard to this, I think the answer is it comes back in general to the point that was made in the last podcast, I think by you, Father, particularly well, in that this is as much about releasing that central control and just letting things happen. Just to go back to those, the beautiful countryside in Europe, that was not centrally planned. That just happened. And it was more beautiful than anything that anyone could imagine. I mean, people go to Italy or to Britain. I'm going to say the British countryside is the most beautiful. All we can do now is preserve it. We don't know how to create in that way. So the National Trust, for example, in the UK, seeks to preserve the Lake District that Wordsworth wrote about and the beauty of it. But we couldn't create a Lake District today. We just wouldn't know how to do it, because they'd sit down, they'd work out a method, they'd introduce a government policy, and they'd impose it. And that, by definition, would destroy the whole means by which this works, which is these vernaculars, I think, and that is we have to trust that these things can come through. It does need, however, those vernaculars to be aware. For example, I would suggest, or at least immersed in that sense of the symbolism of nature, the old things as well as the new. And that's the difficulty, is that I don't know how much of that we have. Maybe we would rediscover it if we just let people do so. I don't know what you think about that.
I completely agree, David. And I think if there's a takeaway from this chapter and sort of a moral that we can apply to our modern world, it's a rediscovery of the vernacular within the world of science, a rediscovery of the ability of the natural process of human inquiry to move freely without the chains of the institutions that bind it, and then all the groupthink that comes along with that. I think science and technology would be liberated right now if it threw off the institutional chains that have accrued over the last, I would say, 5 decades of science, and allow the natural human curiosity and our ability to interact and relate to nature release the discoveries that are there, rather than assuming that scientific progress must be institutionalized and planned. It can't be centrally planned. It never has been. It never has been. And I take that. I have that as a takeaway from Illich. It's of course related to our understanding of how we relate to nature as a species.
Yeah, and in support of that, the podcast that you did, Michel, with what is his name? Terence Keeley, is it? Keeley.
It's a fantastic. I just listened to that.
Yeah, the CAD and Coca Report podcast. If you can find it, go and listen to it. People who are listening to it. He talks at length about how it is a myth that the way that new technologies are developed is that they find the science, and then the science is applied in technology, and that in fact historically it works the other way around. That people kind of just discover what works, and very often it goes against what the scientists have been saying, and then the scientists start examining what is going on in the technology and develop the science after the fact. The science is actually the description of the technology, and rather than the technology being an application of the science. And the great force that has institutionalized this and turned the whole thing around so that the wrong way is government involvement through the universities, particularly government-funded research, which has focused on scientific development, and that is what's corrupted the peer review system. And as I was listening to this conversation, I just thought this is absolutely right. And we need to if we could change the world, I would remove that. But then, as with everything else, we need that evangelization. We need the faith, so that people in their vernaculars then are looking to God for guidance. And so if it's without that, there can still be destructiveness even in the vernacular, but at least there's a chance if you free people up. Some people are going to discover it, I would say.
Very good. I think on that note, anybody else has any final thoughts on this chapter? Next week we'll talk about, I think, the last chapter of the book, which deals, I think, more with economic concerns. But I look forward to it.
All right. So until next week, thank you very much, Father Brad Elliott, Dr. Michel Akkad, Charlie Deist, and I'm David Clayton. See you next week.